Hello, and welcome to Conversations with Matt. We've now covered the basics about morality and whether or not what we see in the world points to the existence of a God. So today what I want to do is ask the question, how would this God interact with these objective morals we've been talking about? And really what we need to do is deal with a dilemma that's been around for about 2,500 years. So everybody get out your togas and let's start talking about Plato. Here's the problem. We've been talking about these objective moral values and have said that they are things that don't change, no matter what the situation is. But how does God relate to these objective moral values? And there's really two basic options. One, God creates the moral values. And two, God recognizes the moral values. Now let's stop and think about those two options for a minute because both of those could end up being a little problematic for people who believe in a God in the traditional sense. The first one says that God creates the moral values. And the obvious question that we have to ask at this point is, well, could God just create any moral values he wanted? I mean, could God decide that rape is good? I mean, we think it's bad because we live in the world in which, at least as far as I understand, rape is objectively bad. But could God have decided that it was good? Do you see the problem? If God can create just any old moral values he wanted, then it makes it difficult to believe in the normal sort of deity that most theists believe in. All right, well, let's take a look at the second option. The second option says that God recognizes the moral values. That means that the moral values are something external to God. Basically, they're above and beyond God, and God simply says, okay, since these moral values exist, I'm going to make them apply to humans now. If this option were true, then God is not the greatest thing in existence. Creator, yes. Greatest thing ever? No. Do you see the problem? Either God could make horrible moral values and wouldn't be the kind of God we'd want to worship, or God would recognize the moral values, but is really a second-tier kind of being. Not quite so awesome. This is known as the Euthyphro dilemma that Plato discussed about 4 centuries before the BC AD changeover. Euthyphro, for those who are interested, is spelled Euthyphro. Not your everyday average word, is it? It's actually somebody's name. So 5 points goes to anyone who already knew how to spell it before this episode. Now, here's the question. How would you solve the Euthyphro dilemma? Can God create any moral values he wants? Or does God recognize a standard outside and above himself? Pause this podcast for a minute and think about your answer, then we'll come back and talk about it. So what did you come up with? Did you choose one of the options? Or did you try to come up with a third option? As you might have guessed, I think there's a third option. Instead of saying that God arbitrarily chooses moral values or that there is a standard above and outside God, it is also possible to say that God creates the moral values but makes the standard his own nature. That means that love is good because God is loving. Fairness is good because God is fair, and so forth. This eliminates the problems we talked about before because the standard is neither above and outside God, nor is it arbitrary. The standard is the character of God. And so that solves the problem we have before us right now, but I'm sure some of you are saying, yes, but what if the character of God isn't so good? Suppose God is evil. I mean, if that's the case, then he could create all of those terrible moral values, and those would be consistent with his nature, right? Well, to answer that question, we need to figure out 2 things. First, which God are we talking about? And second, what has this God done? Does he, she, it act evil? Or what records do we have of what people have said about what this God has done? What is the character that people say this God has? After asking those specific questions, we can begin to look at the character of a specific God and try to figure that question out. However, that's a question for another time. What I'm trying to do is work through things in a way that breaks up very big questions into smaller chunks that are a little bit more manageable, and we can deal with those one issue at a time. The problem is that in dealing with a single issue like this one, there will always be several others that tie into it. So I can't follow every line of questioning immediately. The best that I know how to do is to try to make each series, like this one, explain what the issue is to the best of my knowledge and point you in the direction of some resources that I think might be helpful. As I said before, I put a link to a helpful resource on my website, mattdelockery.com. Look under the first episode in this series. I do, however, think that the issue of God's actions in the world is a pretty important topic, and I plan to go in depth on it at some point, though that probably won't be for a while, since I'm trying to vary the topics up, and there's some other things I want to get through first. But it is something that I intend to talk about, and we'll get there. So how does this work back into everything that we've been talking about? Well, for one, it answers a question that is certain to come up. Namely, if there is a God, how is the idea that God creates moral values actually logical? In other words, how do we avoid those two options that don't seem so good? But I think we can say more than that. I think it does more than just solve the dilemma. Over the course of this series, we've been talking about objective moral values as the way that humans were meant to function. So let's assume the God hypothesis for a moment. So man was created by God, which means that we reflect God in at least some capacity, since the thing created reflects its creator. Just like a painting tells you something about the painter. And if the God hypothesis is valid, then it's very possible that there are ways that we are meant to function and ways that we are not meant to function. So there's a connection between the source of objective moral values and the source of humans themselves. They were both built off the same pattern, so to speak. So it really shouldn't be surprising if the human operating manual comes from the one who designed humans to begin with. It almost, makes sense. So things on the God side seem to be making sense internally. The question that we have to ask then is the same one that we started with. Is there any reason to believe that a God exists? Well, we've looked at the big picture now, and we've tried to get an idea of how this God question affects our worldview. And we've looked at one piece of the puzzle on God's existence. We've taken a look at the question of, do human actions, does the way that humans function imply that there is a God or not? Does it seem more likely that there is a creator or not? And also in doing this, we've touched on the existence of objective morality. Is there such thing as objective morality, or is everything relative? Are all moral values, relative to this group or that group? Are they subjective? Are there ways that we really should or should not function? And doing this also has helped us to be able to take a look at who man is and how he should act in relation to other people. So, as you can tell, there's a whole lot of things in this world to sort of sort out. When we're trying to paint a picture of what this world looks like, there's a lot of parts. And we've touched on some very, very big ones, but there's quite a lot that's left. And over the course of many more series, I hope to be able to start working through some of those with you. Anyway, I hope our first look at the existence of a God has been helpful to you. We're going to take some other looks at that later. I tried to explain things the best I could, but I may or may not have been able to do it well enough for you. It might be beneficial to re-listen to the series and see if it makes better sense the second time through, or listen to some other people's thoughts on the topic. To pursue the latter option, search for the moral argument for God's existence. Whether you do that on Google or whether you're listening to other podcasts or YouTube, blogs, whatever, the moral argument for God's existence is what will help you find this discussion that we've been engaging in over the last several episodes. Either way, please continue to look for answers to important questions like this one. Read and listen to people who explain why you should think this way or that way, whether you agree with them or not. Remember, that's the important thing that you're trying to find. It's not so much the opinion that people have and whether you agree with them. Read and listen to people who explain why you should think this way or that way. Look for the reasonings. Remember, it's not an immediate conclusion that we're looking for when we're searching for truth. We're looking for the reasonings. Because if we look at good reasoning and follow the evidence wherever it leads, then we have a better chance of getting to the right conclusion. So start looking for reasons to things and ask the question, why do you think that? A lot. Ask that question on a regular basis. No matter what you believe or where you're starting, this will help you move forward. Next week, we're going to start our second series working through the letter to the Colossians. We're going to be focusing on chapter 1, verses 9 through 14. So if you can, take a look at those verses before next week. And if you've been enjoying this podcast, please recommend it to a friend. Let them know you've been enjoying it so far and that they might as well. So, thank you, and talk to you next week.